Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you for DJing, Abigail, as always. Welcome to this presentation on the downside of AP, the impact of the College Board's billion-dollar courses on our children. This is a presentation of Brookline for Racial Justice and Equity, or BRJE, and we want to extend special thanks to Brookline Interactive Group for technical support for this virtual event. And thank you all for showing up tonight when you could be doing anything else. I am Colin Stokes, and I'm a Pierce and Brookline High School parent. I'm a member of BRJE, and I will be moderating this conversation. I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about why we thought this would be a valuable topic for information and education. A lot of parents of Brookline high schoolers know AP as basically the designation for the hardest class in any subject. That's certainly how I have been thinking about it. The ones that mean the most on the college applications. And it's also the name of the very high stakes tests in those subjects that are just wrapping up now in maybe tomorrow. It's the last day, I think. And maybe if you followed the news this year of the AP's new African American history course that's been piloting in several states, including Massachusetts, and the revision that the College Board made to that curriculum after pressure from the right-wing leaders in Florida. But what is AP and why is it a part of our high school life? What I can say is that Brookline High School purchases 18 AP courses from the College Board, and the College Board is a private nonprofit organization. And 500 students each year take about 1,000 AP exams in Brookline alone, which you know if you have a child who's taking the test, and there is a fee for each of those tests. The College Board has an annual revenue of about $1.1 billion. And both our students and the school district are contributing to that $1 billion. So our question is there a downside to that investment? I know that there have been critics for many years arguing that, among other things, AP classes are test-driven, so they may favor shallow memorization over more deeper learning. It's reasonable to wonder if they contribute to the high levels of stress that our children experience in this very competitive race for higher education. And what do we make of the glaring racial inequities, both in rates of participation in the courses and in the scores? Fortunately, in Brookline, we're very lucky to have teachers who can help us unpack these questions. And our panel tonight will examine the potential negative impact of the AP on students. We're going to use an academic lens, an mental health lens, equity lens. They're speaking on their own. They're not on behalf of the school or the district or any other organization that they're affiliated with. Our goal is to provide historical and instructional context. May not be widely known. We don't anticipate finding solutions tonight. Sorry. I'm not really engaging in a debate, but we hope to begin to envision other ways that Brookline High School could set our children up for college success. So I'm really excited to introduce this group to you. First, we have Malcolm Cawthorn, longtime teacher at Brookline High School and currently the director of the METCO program, as well as a BHS alum and parent. Following Malcolm, we'll hear from Dan Bresman, a coordinator of SWS, both a counselor and a dean. On the parent side, we have Abigail Ortiz, who is co-director of Racial Justice and Equity Initiatives at the amazing Southern Jamaica Plain Health Center and the Beyond Amazing Racial Reconciliation and Healing Project. She is an alum of BHS and SWS. And finally, there's Abby Erdman, a former BHS and SWS English teacher and the founder of Brookline for Racial Justice and Equity. So you're welcome here. So let's have a virtual round of applause to thank these four for taking the time to share their information and analysis and perspectives. We're going to hear from them, and then we'll have time for some questions. As you think of the things that you want to ask them, you just type the questions in the chat box. They will go directly to me, and I can pass them on after they've had a chance to talk. Sound good, panelists? All right, I'm going to start with Malcolm, and I'm going to make some of the rest of you just vanish, but just temporarily. Don't be alarmed. Malcolm, good to see you. Can you tell us about your experience with AP and what you've learned about its history and how you've seen the program affect the lives of your students?
Sure. It's an honor to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to start with just a little bit of this personal context and how this is a complicated issue. I had one of my children take multiple APs, and we kind of went back and forth with that within our house. But ultimately, she took them. I also have so much love. My friend and sister Stefan is on here, and she leads the African American Latinx Scholars Program. And both my daughters were in that, and part of their goal is to push for more representation in high-level classes and to challenge and support kids in that. And I also believe in that. And like I said, had my children in that. And so, when I talk about this personal impact, as well as some of the history that I'm going to get into, please know, like, even with that, when it came down to personal choices and advice and everything, even with the knowledge of this history, it was not an easy decision to come to. And so I wanted to start with that before I really dive into the deep history and then, ultimately pan into some more current things. And so one of the things I think is really hard, particularly when we grew up in Boston, is to think about schools and their function and their courses and their presence in the way that they may not have been told to be. In other words, we tend to see them as great equalizers. We tend to see them as things that can move people up in intellect and in society and in their class. And particularly in Boston, we love to adhere to that. And so I usually start really early with Boston. We talk about the Boston Latin School, created in 1635. At that point, we only had 4 colonies under the British Empire. Massachusetts had only been a colony for 5 years, even though people were here colonizing. We weren't officially a colony until 1630. But as much as I say that, as much as I think Bostonians didn't have a lot of pride in that being the first public school, I always like to mention it is also the beginning of segregation in our country. I can't see all the faces, but I know a lot of faces on here. Most of us on the Zoom could not have gone to Boston Latin in 1635. You had to be white, male, and Christian. And so, if you just scan and look, that eliminates most everybody on the Zoom. Right. And it's really important to understand, as much as we want to give credit for Boston for that and all those other things, and that's a real thing. It is also real that sets our institutions up to be segregated. And so for this context, I really want to make sure that we understand that, especially as we put that in light around the AP exam. This idea of sorting and segregating people. And that is a really important thing to grasp. Most know Harvard was founded the following year. If you really study how empires are built, as much as they are through guns and germs and steel and all the other things we talk about, sugar and things like that, they are through educational institutions. One of the first things the Spanish do in 1492 after Columbus sails is they create the School of Arts and Letters to establish what real Spanish is. Right? It's not a mistake that Harvard is created when there's only 6 colonies here. Because part of establishing empire is to say what it means to be smart and where you go, where smart people go and who the privileged are. And so it's also important to put that into context. And to show how this works a little bit is I usually like to use a concept by Derek Bell, who is often talked about in really negative ways, mostly connected to critical race theory. But the concept I would actually try to get you to see is what he would refer to as interest convergence. And what he really means by that is that we actually like the sorting and segregation of people. When we change is when it's in the interest of the people in power. When it becomes in their interest, then we shift. And so to give you an example, I just mentioned Harvard. Boston Latin wouldn't have any racial or even gender diversity really until the 1800s. Harvard graduates its first Native American in 1655 because there's an interest in that. There's an interest in bringing Native Americans into the empire. And so when you have that interest, then you do things and make moves. And it was a part of a way to acculturate Native Americans into being what they would ultimately refer to as Americans, but at that point was still referring to as British colonists. And so I mention that because, you know, when we find that interest convergence, we tend to find results. However, they're usually sort of backdoor results, and they're not, they're usually seen as like, oh, well, those people just worked hard and that's how they got there, as opposed to really realizing, no, we finally just gave access and they showed they could produce. And so it's a really important thing to think about. I'm going to, you know, move forward a little farther in history to Carl Brigham, who is most known for being the creator of the SAT. And that's true. The first SAT was given in 1926. Carl Brigham was a psychologist who was a Stanford professor. And it's important to put that time into a frame, right? Most people learn about the 1920s and they think about women with raised hemlines and shorter hair and smoking cigarettes, or the Harlem Renaissance and Langston Hughes poems, and all those really cool things that are very real. And we forget the real harsh realities of what was coming out in the 1920s. The 1920s is riddled with, you know, anti-immigration things. We actually write 3 of our most restrictive immigration laws in the 1920s, which is a result of World War I, as well as our nativist attitude in the country. The 2 things I want to bring about with this is it's also the Great Migration. So what we're seeing is massive amounts of Black folks moving in particular to the north and to the west into our cities. These are cities that have been won through a lot of different politics. You know, probably most famous like Tammany Hall in New York, as well as you know, places like Chicago, where that's where the title "The Windy City" actually comes from, not because it's windy, but because of its politics. And so it's just really important to know that that's where these Black folks are moving. And one of the biggest things as we talk about these tests and the SATs and what will become College Board is the eugenics movement. Because Carl Brigham was an open eugenicist. He believed that genetically people were superior and inferior. And so it's important to know that the founder of the SAT and what would be the founder of College Board helps establish such a thing, right? And this is far broader than just race. In this time, we have Jewish quotas for entrance into college. In this time, we're restricting not just immigrants getting into the country, but also where immigrants can go. In a moment, I'll talk about sorting of students and where we're sending them through this time. And so I think it's really important to look at that foundation, because if you think about that as the foundation of our testing for college entrance and all these other things tied to College Board, I would argue you actually have to revamp the entire system. You have to blow it up to actually get it right. Like, you're not going to be able to make small tweaks to remove the eugenic ideals or the basic purpose of what the tests were designed to do. Just changing the scoring won't do it. And so to move ahead, and because this is about AP, the first AP exam was given in 1952. It's actually a product of the Ford Foundation. And in 1953, College Board takes it over. It should not be remiss that the first AP exams were given at 3 of the most elite, prestigious prep schools in America. The 2 you will recognize easily are Andover and Exeter. Lawrenceville's the third, but most people don't know Lawrenceville. But most people in Massachusetts know Andover and Exeter. Like, I mean, yeah, you can't. Andover and Exeter produced close to 10 presidents. You don't get much more elite than those two schools. All right. And so that should actually tell you a lot in terms of who AP exams are originally designed for and to get a leg up. But again, I want to put this into a context of the time. We're in a post-World War II society in the 1950s. In that, there's a lot of radical changes that are happening to our society that is actually a little frightful for colleges. I would say the first is the GI Bill. The GI Bill will allow veterans to go to colleges because they fought in what was seen as the big war and has often been dubbed as the greatest generation. They know this is going to actually get a lot of people into college for the first time ever, and allow them to have other things, wealth through buying homes and business, all that other stuff. But really, when you think about AP in college, that's important. So one of the things that is easy to establish is who takes that test and who can we let in versus who do we have to let in. And one of the things that has been highly pointed out is that the GI Bill itself was racist. That yes, if I was Black and I had the GI Bill, and I lived in a segregated state or where I couldn't actually use that to go anywhere, and they wouldn't honor it for certain things. So as somebody who was Black, who had that, I would actually, and we'll broaden in a minute, to other groups we racialize, because Latinx actually shouldn't be a racial group, but we've racialized it in the United States. I will say, a couple of things with that is also some of the things that are happening to our great institutions in the United States. So I would actually say Jackie Robinson integrating Major League Baseball is a huge, frightening point. Because if you can integrate baseball, we can sure integrate our colleges and other things. I would also say there's a serious movement in the same time. Jackie Robinson integrates baseball in 1947. It's a famous case in California, Westminster versus Mendez, which is a case that reads so similar to like the famous Black civil rights cases, where Mendez essentially lived across the street from a brand new school, but could not go there because he was Chicano. And they went through the whole thing of like, oh, they're going to bring diseases and all these other things that they talk about when they talk about racializing people. And that case was won. And there's two people really important connected to that case. First is Thurgood Marshall, who will go on to win a lot of cases, as well as become the first Black Supreme Court justice. And at the time, the governor of California was Earl Warren, who will then later hear those cases on the Supreme Court as Chief Justice. And so I mentioned that because that is part of this era, right? Where we're moving through this. And I'm going to mention a couple more cases, and then I'm going to go back to Derek Bell. I mentioned Thurgood Marshall. In 1950, there's two huge cases that helped set up what will be Brown versus Board of Ed. Sweat versus Painter in Texas, McLaurin versus Oklahoma. They're both in 1950. Essentially, these are pushing ideas of advanced education. So Texas doesn't have a law school where Black folks can go. They have segregated schools, they have Black colleges, none of them have a law school. So Sweat, who is a Black man who wants to go to law school in Texas, they argue he is a citizen of Texas. The state has to provide him with this opportunity to go to law school. And so Texas scrambles, they try to get a law school at Texas Southern University so that he doesn't have to go. And then ultimately the Supreme Court says, too bad, you don't have one. You have to allow him to go. Very similar in the case of Oklahoma. McLaurin was a Black man who was a teacher, wanted an advanced degree in education. They had no offerings for him at the HBCUs. And so he was able to push for that. And they also moved McLaurin a little bit because what they said was equal right to education was allowing him to sit in the hallway while whites sat in the class because they didn't want him actually integrated. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. That's not actually being a student. He has to be in the classroom. And I mention those because interest convergence is coming, right? And it's important to get that. And so as that interest convergence, particularly with Warren and others, this starts to happen. And so In 1954, we have Brown versus Board of Ed, and that's really important, but I also want to mention Warren's all deliberate speed comment, because that is really the key. So we know a lot about some things, like the Little Rock Nine is super important in 1957. But I also want to mention there's the Harlem Nine in 1958, where through all types of policies and zoning and real estate covenants and other things, Harlem kids were essentially getting a lesser education because of segregation. And the terms we used to use were de facto and de jure. I've been one, and I'll say I've never actually believed those. Because if you have all these policies and you put it on paper and governments are upholding it, including school committees, well, then it's not cultural. It's actually governmental. It's actually legal. And so, you could say, oh, well, it's New York, so Black people just live in Harlem. Well, we know that wasn't the case until they were allowed to live in Harlem. And particularly Jews sold them their real estate so they could live in Harlem. Like that's how it works. And you can say the same argument for Mattapan and Boston and all kinds of other places around the country where, certain groups who were marginalized were willing to sell to Blacks, and then that became the Black neighborhood. And so that is super important. There's also the lost generation of Virginia, Prince Edwards County, where instead of integrating, they just canceled school from 1959 to 1965. What that meant is you would eventually have 11-year-olds starting in kindergarten because of that. But also I like to mention in 1963, Boston had a march from Roxbury to City Hall because they were complaining about segregated schools and poor and decrepit schools. Most people seem to remember the Titans. That's in Alexandria, Virginia. That takes place in 1971. And Boston, with Judge Garrity is in 1974. And I mention all this to kind of tie this up because at the same time as we're doing all this legal stuff, the Great Migration is ending roughly around 1970. But also there's a really important Immigration Act that is passed in 1965. And this leads me to the last point and try to wrap up. You have to think about the AP exams within the Cold War context. So part of the reason I mentioned that Immigration Act is we learned our immigration policies were wildly racist. And while we're in the Cold War and we're saying how bad communism is in Europe and all these other things, they push back on us and say, you guys are crazy. Like, you treat your people who've been there longer than some of y'all as second-class citizens who can't sit on the same toilet with you. And so one of the movements in that wasn't just opening schools and all that, it was also to then open immigration. And what that really opened up was bringing in a lot of folks from particularly Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. We get the most immigrants through that time. And some have argued that's why the Great Migration kind of slows. I would say it actually adds to the Great Migration. It's how you get hip hop in the Bronx. It adds to the Great Migration and brings more flavor, but it also makes segregation wildly different, right? You may have an Afro, but you also may speak with a Spanish accent. And so how do we regulate that? And so one of the ways to regulate that is through AP exams and Cold War thinking through the civil rights movement, and that is really in the form of tracking. And so if you think about AP within that, even though it starts at 52, remember, that's when we're doing all this integration stuff. That's where all that fear is. It's fear of Jackie Robinson, it's fear of all these others, right? And so we see the rise of a few things within that to push APs. So one of the ways to try and get white kids to go to school with Black kids was to put magnet schools in Black neighborhoods, because it might bring white kids there because they could take AP exams. We know that failed. Most magnet schools don't exist anymore because even then, white kids didn't do that. Why would they do that? It's actually easier to move out of the city and take AP exams at a place like, a suburban school, perhaps Brookline, right? Segregation of school in this kind of way and tracking could be really old. Like you could mention historically Black colleges as a part of tracking. All that's fair. But the tracking we tend to think of in this Cold War era is this idea of leveling, right? Basic, standard, or college prep, honors, and AP. And you have to think of AP within that realm, right? One of the ways to say somebody is college ready is to say you take an AP exam. Well, if you create that where only white kids can take it, particularly only white resource kids can take it, then you run into this. And I mention this because I want to lock back into Brookline. Brookline, for a long time, you could only take AP exams with a teacher recommendation. That actually lasted until 2000. And I know for some of the younger folks on here, that seems like a long time ago. That's not that long ago. Not when you remember that Boston Latin started in 1635, as well as the AP exam started in 1952, right? That was a way to create this segregation. And you say, well, I could get, as a Black kid, I could get a teacher recommendation. But we actually know and follow data in Brookline that actually was not happening and still does not happen. That Black kids who actually do well in honors and advanced classes still will not be recommended to take the next honors and advanced class. And so it's just really important that we acknowledge those things and think about the interest convergence. And so now there's an interest convergence of trying to make it seem like we're not racist through our AP exam. In particular, in 2016, 70% of the African Americans who took at least one AP exam did not pass it. Whereas the rest of the average rate for AP exam is about 42% don't pass. And so when you think about in that context, it's really important to think about where we are in Brookline and how this plays out. And so I am going to stop there. And I really appreciate the time to kind of explain the stuff around AP and race and other things. And yeah, I appreciate the time, and we'll take questions after the others do their fantastic presentations.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. I'm clapping on behalf of everybody else who's muted. So imagine the roar. So wow, I didn't know you were going to take us through so many centuries. So thank you for that. And please make a note of your questions now, or just chat them right to me, because I'm sure there's some things that are mulling around in your head, audience. So thank you so much, Malcolm. I'm going to replace you in Zoom, just in Zoom, with Dan. So Dan, I think a lot of us parents find it really difficult to imagine what would happen if if BHS stopped providing AP classes in certain subjects. And I know that you have done some work in non-leveled classes, and you've also made some observations about scheduling, things like that, that suggest that reducing AP offerings might actually free up some resources and allow students to learn more. So I'd love to give you the floor and tell us what you are thinking about those things.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, everybody. I'm honored to be here with you and to follow Malcolm Cawthorn. I have what I can share that's most meaningful is some of what my experience has been in this role of working with students over the years on schedules, on college admissions processes. I think that one thing that Colin just triggered for me is the idea of what would happen if Brookline High School didn't offer an AP option in maybe one of the departments. And if Brookline High didn't offer any AP option in a department, would our students stop getting into the most elite schools? Well, the answer is that thankfully we have experience with this, and Brookline High does not offer AP in the English department. And somehow, even without that offering, we've been able, the students I work with have been able to get into the most selective, traditionally most elite schools in the country. So how is it possible? And it's possible in part because we created an opportunity for students to not need to do it. If in the English department, as in other departments, we did offer AP to some students, then many students would feel compelled to take it. So what we see across other departments is whether or not it's the right choice for a student, whether or not it's going to be a tremendous source of stress, whether or not it's the AP courses they're enrolled in are going to cause them to spend multiple hours in my office and those of others in tears, trying to figure out how to manage the stress and the time crunch. If we offer it and a student doesn't take it, they are going to potentially be significantly disadvantaged in the college admissions process, certainly for the schools that so many folks are aspiring to because they're regarded as so elite. So what I find in my experience that's particularly angst-ridden in this regard is that I find myself time and again having to fight to get my students into AP courses, regardless of the beliefs around them. And I know that many students who may feel that they have an internal question about whether or not they should be taking AP courses feel compelled to try to get the AP courses and try to get as many of them as they can. Were we to not offer, say, in another department, as we don't in English, and so none of our students were able to take an AP class in another department because it wasn't an option to any of them, they don't have BHS peers to be judged against who did take it. And so it has the capacity to liberate students from feeling compelled to take courses that they may not necessarily even feel that they so firmly believe in. So part of what we have is a scenario where many students and folks like me have to fight to get into courses in order that they not be disadvantaged, whether or not those courses are inherently the right choice for them. And then those courses, time and again, we see as we work with students and colleagues to attempt to limit the stress, because we could easily have another Zoom or another series of Zooms about the social emotional needs of our kids today, and what is research indicated to be a significant escalation of social emotional needs and concerns for our kids. We could explore that in depth, but at the same time, we need to battle to get our kids into these courses that when we try to make these adjustments, oftentimes it doesn't even apply to the AP courses. When we say, let's try to dial back on the demands of kids during certain times of the year, let's try to dial back on the demands of the homework over the weekends, let's try to dial back on the total number of hours that students are compelled to spend and how late they're compelled to stay up at night, often doesn't apply to the AP courses, because those courses need to continue to meet a sequence and a calendar to prepare for that test at the end. You can't dial it back so easily. So I find that we're in a quandary where, believe in the AP courses or not, students are disadvantaged if they don't take them. Many students are having exceptionally difficult experiences because they feel compelled to take them. And I often find that I hear other folks in schools or around schools say, if a kid doesn't want to take it, or if a kid is concerned, or if the family's concerned and it's going to be too much, have them choose not to take it. It's just a choice. They don't need to take these courses. And while there's a version of that being true, the other is, for many kids and families, the question is, well, am I making the choice to disadvantage myself? Do I really have that choice? Is it really so easy to decline when the system has set me up into a position where I'm not protected from it, right? There's an element that you could regard of as protection, where if there was some limitation, fewer would be compelled. So we find ourselves in a very strange dynamic with a significant amount of stress and angst for students and some adults trying to make choices about how to navigate this. It may be that the best I can do is be positioned to answer questions from folks as we go through the meeting about how this impacts schedules and scheduling, and more clarity on college admissions process. I've worked with many, many students over the years. So maybe I'll pause there and give others an opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dan. Really, really fascinating perspective that I'm grateful to you for sharing. I'm going to bring in Abigail now, and I'm going to let myself show up too this time. So,
Hello,
Abigail, you're a parent as well as a racial justice facilitator with both youth and adults, and I know racial justice is one of the key questions that everyone on this call has in common as an issue that we care so much about. So have the floor. What are your concerns about AP?
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And I just want to send love out to all the beloveds here who came. So Abigail Ortiz, white, racially Polish, German, Swedish, and Welsh ethnically. I mean, I feel like the history just got laid down. So I just want to acknowledge Derek Bell, Stefanik, Delgado, Crenshaw, like all of the critical race theorists who have really been part of my own education. And I know CRT is sort of, everybody's, thinking about it in the wrong way these days, but essentially all it's asking is, how is racism operating here? And when we think about the establishment of our entire education system and our healthcare system, which I'm part of, and our housing system and our transit system, it is all, rooted in chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and what we call now structural racism. And so the piece that I really want to acknowledge as a white person for all my white folk who are here is, how, I can show you all the data about why all of these systems aren't working for anyone. Always the greatest burden is on Black and Indigenous folk, with whites always an advantage. And yet the advantage continues to be incredibly small and smaller and smaller for the majority of white people. And I just see that in such a visceral way when I'm working with white young folk at Brookline High and beyond. I mean, we at the health center, we work with white folk from different schools in a sort of a multiracial racial justice and health equity training project through Southern, which is licensed under Brigham. And many of my white identified and BIPOC identified students are in AP courses. And we just, got through AP tests, and it's just incredibly challenging to listen to them, particularly when I have white young people in white affinity, when we're talking about what it's like to be an AP, the pressure that they're experiencing, the memorization they need to do, and in some ways the sort of apolitical and ahistorical way that they're learning. So folks really don't have to engage with each other. It's an incredibly racialized space, right? And I want to just honor, that at Brookline High, there's also a lot of Asian folk in AP classes. And there's a lot of this kind of model minority crap that gets propagated, which, the experience of all of the Asian students that we talk to in AP is incredibly different than the white students. And, I think it's really important for white folk to remember that there's like a really important conversation that, all peoples of color cross-ethnically need to have without white people there. And that, as white folk, we really need to have our own conversation about what we've internalized. But suffice to say, in addition to just honoring the history and how I see AP kind of nestled in Brown v. Board and the American Highway Act and all of these, I see it's just so clear when you look at the history where what this test is about, and it's firmly rooted in eugenics. I also just don't see it working for white folk. And I think that I'll leave with this, that the project, I think, of white folk in the racial justice and liberation movement is that we get really clear about our own skin in the game. So, that we're not trying, I think trying to do work on behalf of people is not helpful. I hope all the male identified people here are not fighting patriarchy on my behalf. I can show you your data. It's slowly killing you, and I feel the same way about racism and white supremacy for white people. I think there's a million ways that it's absolutely not working. And white folks need to sort of get clear about that and come from that place. And I think AP is a great example. And I think I get why people take AP. I certainly understand why BIPOC folk advocate to get their kids into AP. And to Dan's point, I think until it's removed completely, it's not fair, right, to critique it and critique particularly folks of color who are trying to access it. But I think, I think it's just the experience of the young ones that I'm with. It's pretty hard to be an AP, and it's, not necessarily helping our young ones integrate, head, heart, and spirit in the way I think they need to face what's coming down the pike. So I'll stop there. I think Abby Erdman, who's actually my teacher from SWS, can talk a little bit about teaching, untracked classes.
Thank you so much, Abigail. Awesome. So finally, yes, we have Abby, who is now going to join me here. So reflecting on your career teaching English in Brookline, what do you think of the connection between the connection between wanting a challenging class and wanting and believing something about AP designation as being challenging.
So I just want to start by saying thank you to the other brilliant participants, and Colin, thank you for moderating. Really grateful. And thank you all for showing up. I want to pick up on just a sentence that Malcolm dropped, which is the question of what it means to be smart. What does it mean to be smart? And, you know, the AP courses think they answer that. They test that. They have an idea of what smartness is. And I want to talk from the perspective of someone. I began as a downstairs teacher. The second year I was in Brookline High School, I taught a Shakespeare class. And I taught those kids that, if you'll pardon me for labeling, AP kids who were already, you know, going on that track. And they were, you know, charged up and excited and whatever. What they remembered most from my class was on Shakespeare's birthday, we went out in the halls and recited Shakespeare. Not exactly a heady intellectual class, the rest of it was. I think what matters in teaching is so many other things than what the AP is looking for and testing for. And my situation was a little bit unique because I had the blessing of teaching in SWS, where all our classes are unleveled, where 10th, 11th, and 12th graders are in the same class. And kids who had been labeled one way or another are also in with each other. So I always say our English classes are democratic in lots of ways. But I think what's so lovely about this is it gets at what does it mean to be smart? And it's not a simple answer. And those kids that have sort of done well in the AP classes, I want to just share an example. And I've talked to this student enough about this, so I know he's comfortable sharing it. In the second semester of his senior year, Peter walked into my class. And he'd already gotten in early to Harvard, and he looked around and he said, I've been at this high school for 4 years. I've never been in a class with a Black or brown student. The class was identity, race, and literature. It was over half BIPOC. And his experience in that class profoundly changed him. He went out, he did go to Harvard. He ended up studying inequality and teaching economics at the University of Chicago as a result of that class. So I guess I'm also talking about, you know, what really is learning, what is challenging, what is public education at its best. And I want to give a different example, which is I had a student who, you know, he was clearly a student with learning differences. And he was in a class where we read To the Lighthouse. Not easy going, right? But all of my more traditionally smart kids were so thrown by the lack of punctuation, they could not get through it. And he was just like, no problem reading this. And I just use that as an example of, you know, when we try to begin to sort kids by intelligence, I mean, there's so many different, I'm not saying anything that anyone on this call doesn't know, but what I am advocating is it's possible to have an incredibly challenging class. The challenges can come in all different ways. And the kind of learning, I mean, what learning do we value? I would say I value learning how to write, for example. Well, I'm not convinced the AP composition test, which is based on one short composition, is, and thankfully the English department doesn't offer it, is a way to teach good writing. Good writing involves brainstorming, thinking, writing, rewriting, getting feedback. It's a long, slow process. And speed is not relevant. You're not going to come out with something better when you go faster. In fact, you're likely to come out with something that's fairly obvious. So I think if we're looking to build deep thinkers, You know, a class, for example, I had a class that offered 12 writing projects in a semester. And the students were allowed to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And I started teaching that class because I realized when students went to write their college essay, they didn't know how to write it. And I thought there hasn't been enough work done in speaking in your own voice and accessing your own experience and having an interesting idea and an angle. And so we're going to write a paper a week. They're a way to bring challenges to students that don't involve a test, that involve deep reflective thinking and revision. And so I would say, I mean, not that all our classes in SWX work beautifully or flawlessly or whatever, but I think most students come out of there feeling skilled and challenged. And I think that's the best idea of what an AP class will be, which is rich and interesting and leaving you with more skills and more curiosity. I'll end there. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, so I'm bringing the panelists back up. We have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. So, and fortunately, we've got some great ones coming into the chat. I'm going to start with one from Amy Takinami, and I'll read her whole commentary because it's as you would expect, on point. I'm all for abolishing our current higher ed industrial complex. But while we're in it, and our young people are in it, I'm curious how you grapple with the fact that AP courses also allow our low-income students in particular to save money by getting a head start on credits. And some are even able to graduate early due to that head start.
I could talk to that. I don't, it's a little, yeah. I appreciate Amy's comment. And I think when she speaks about an opportunity, I think that opportunity is real. And I think I can count on one hand how many kids have not gone through 8 semesters as a full-time student. And as long as you're doing that, you aren't actually saving money. You know what I mean? Like if you're a full-time student, you pay that rate. And so I know that. In fact, the 2 kids I was closest to who didn't do that and graduated early didn't take any AP classes. They went through the summer and did some other things. And so I think I think a lot of times we sell that to low-income students. I would also argue, in particular, so this was my father's basis of research, standardized testing and impacts on particularly African-American folks and like that. But also my mother worked in higher ed. And the reality is a lot of colleges don't even honor those credits anymore, particularly if they're in the area that you really enjoy and intend to study. So the reality is if you're going to go be a scientist, if you actually want to get credit for something through an AP, you should take US history. Because they'll honor that. But most colleges, when you get there, they're like, nah, you got to take our science class because AP doesn't show much around lab work or all these other things. So, it's the same sort of thing. Like, my kid who did take APs, like, she also had some college credit. They didn't honor her AP in Spanish because she was a Spanish major. They didn't honor her essentially English 101 at another college because she was an English major. But they took her calculus credit, because that didn't matter for her major. So when you take an AP exam and something you actually enjoy and want, and then go study it, most of the time you don't actually get credit for that. And that would be what I would tell somebody. I would also say for most time, like, it only works if like you can chop a semester off or go as a part-time student, which then is also a pitfall because you can lose your financial aid if you go as a part-time student. And so that would be my sort of talk with them. Like, it might work out. It might. I won't deny that. I know that has happened. And again, I can't think of any of my kids who graduated. Actually, I just saw a kid today who had IP and never took an AP class. He got into an accelerated program at LaSalle and he's done it 3 years. But he never took an advanced placement class. So
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Malcolm. Abby, did you have something you wanted to add to?
The only thing I would say is, and I appreciate Amy always, is now we have to look at easing the problem of tuition for low-income students. I mean, if we're going to rush them through college, then I say, well, wait a minute, let's solve the real problem, which is let's make colleges affordable and not ram them through these courses that aren't going to serve them well. So yes, let's dismantle the educational establishment and let's make it accessible, truly accessible, and not push our kids through AP classes. That's what I wanted to add.
Let's just spend a little bit more time in the classroom with a question from Melanie Ho, who asks, how similar to real college courses are AP courses?
Oh.
they're not similar at all in
No.
history.
Right.
I've argued with our teachers associates department. I've never taken a test as hard as that AP exam in US history. Now I was a history major, I was a social studies major, but well, no, because in college, like the class that they take for juniors, that's split in half in college. In most colleges, I took like the section of US 1, like 1607 to the Civil War, and then took my final and got a credit. And then somewhere along the path, I took from Civil War to current, took a final and got a credit. So the test you take is worth 2 credits, really, in my mind. Because you got to say from 1607 to now. I never took a class that hard. And if it did last throughout the breadth of US history, it was thematic.
I would
don't think
add,
it
if
goes at all. Yeah.
I would add, if I can, that there's nobody in colleges starting their first class at 8 a.m., taking class after class after class after class, all the way until 3, and without the break, and then having all the work that comes from taking 5 or 6 classes at once, while also trying to manage other things. So in terms of what it's like, even if you were taking an AP class that had exceptionally advanced, science or math content or something like that, the experience that you're having does not match anything you'd experience anywhere.
Awesome. Okay, let's close with this this question from Megan Kennedy Justice, which is really about subjectivity versus objectivity. There have been claims that the College Board, mainly by the College Board, that their tests are less racist than the subjective decisions that are made by guidance counselors and admissions officers. Thoughts?
I mean, I can only speak to this in my experience in the healthcare system as a improvement science policy design person, that anything by definition applied neutrally will always reproduce inequity. So there is no way to have a policy or practice. You don't need any more overt racial animus to produce this stuff. It is baked into the cloud now. So we can keep going after individual racist and behaviors, and we should. I'm not talking about, no, let's call that and name that. But if you're applying one test across the board, by definition, you're going to replicate, white supremacy, patriarchy, capital. I mean, it's all going to just show up. And in fact, in many ways, it usually advantages the folks who are already advantaged even more. So I can completely critique recommendations from human beings. That's a whole other conversation. But if you have any blanket policy, will always make things worse. It'd be hard to find an example where it doesn't, if you pull back enough and look at a big enough sample size.
I would also argue that the AP exams aren't objective. Like, I know they say they are, like I've argued with departments and others, like rubrics aren't objective. Like no matter how much you train people, like they're not objective. Like, I mean, even what they select to put on the test is not objective. And I would just say the idea that stuff that comes through is objective. Again, one of the biggest complaints, particularly for science, was that that test cannot show what true lab skills are for a science person. And so while content, it may feel objective, it's actually really hard to say it's objective. And so, I would just argue that. And particularly with College Board, that has been a critique for a very long time, that they were actually testing cultural things all along the path, and particularly elitist things.
Well, I just want to, I'm going to ask for snaps, applause. You can't unmute, but we can see some of you. Please soak in those virtual claps, panelists. Malcolm, Dan, Abigail, and Abby, really exciting conversation. And thank you to all of the participants and the questions that you posted. I'm sorry we don't have time for more questions, but it's just the beginning, and we'll continue to talk. We're going to make this recording available, so if you had friends who registered but couldn't make it, they'll be receiving it as well. Thank you all so much. Have a great night, and appreciate each of you. Play us out? Yeah, perfect.
It ain't all good, and that's the truth.